Hey everyone, welcome back to Shop Life. In this video, I'm just going to go over 20 of the most common issues with the E92, E90, 3 Series. Most of the issues I'm going to be talking about will not apply to the M's. They're mostly going to be for just the normal 3 Series sedans and coupes. So let's go and get started. What we have here is a 2006 330i. So it's one of the first E90s that came out in 2006. It's very early production before the facelift or anything like that. So this does have the N52 motor. It's actually one of the first N52s in the 3 Series because the E46 all had the N54s up until the last production. Alright, so here we have it. We'll start off with the engine bay, start discussing the problems in the engine bay first. So first and foremost, the early model E90, E92s, the 06 through 09, they all use aluminum bolts for a lot of the items. So all the valve cover bolts are aluminum, the oil filter housing bolts are aluminum, the crank sensors, cam sensors, solenoids, oil pan gasket, even the head bolts are aluminum. Whenever you're servicing any of these items, you end up having to replace all the bolts. All the fasteners have to be replaced, and then if you do end up dropping one while you're working, you can't pick it up with a magnet. It gets a lot harder to find. The only reason I can see why BMW would do this is for weight reduction, but I don't understand how much weight they reduce by using all these aluminum bolts. But anyways, let's continue on. So with the aluminum bolts, the valve cover gasket. That's for almost any car. The valve cover gasket on these also does tend to leak, and it is actually a metal gasket on these. So whenever you do replace the valve cover gasket, be ready to have a bunch of broken aluminum bolts. But luckily with the aluminum bolts, once they break, you can pull off the valve cover, and usually if there's still part of the bolt coming out of the head, you can just twist off with your hand or using a vice grip. So that's one major issue. The other issue is the oil filter housing. So this is a lot more accessible than on previous Beamers. So on here, you just take off the bolt right here, one on the bottom. In some cases, like the N54s, you do end up having to remove some of the intake manifold, or at least loosening some of the bolts, so that way you could pull it and get that last bolt that's in there. So the oil filter housing on these cars, they actually have a coolant intake as well, as you can see from right here. So what starts to happen when that gasket starts to fail, you'll start seeing chunks of that gasket, which is black, in the coolant. You might even start seeing some coolant mixed with oil. So a lot of people can mistake that for a blown head gasket, when in reality it's just the oil filter housing gasket starting to let go. With the aluminum bolts, the head bolts. Head bolts are torqued down to a pretty crazy number. Since they are aluminum and they tend to stretch, a lot of them end up breaking. The most common one that breaks is right in between the intake and the oil filter housing. You can even see it from right out here. When that bolt breaks, you start leaking oil around that head gasket. Sometimes if you don't take care of it soon enough, you might even blow your head gasket, so even replacing the bolt will not take care of the issue. In order to fix that bolt, you do have to pull out the whole manifold. That's the only way that you can pull out the bolt. It's about this long. Whenever you take off the valve cover, you also want to check for any other head bolts that might be broken. Moving on, in the front of the engine we have the cam sensors, the Vanos solenoids. The E90s, E92s have many issues with those. They start throwing fault codes. Usually what happens when the valve cover gasket starts leaking, it'll start leaking over those connectors and coat them with oil. So usually you can just get away with just cleaning the connectors and then just putting them back in, and that might solve your issue. If it doesn't, those solenoids and those sensors are a little expensive, so you might end up having to replace those more often. Now the expansion tank is external. It's not attached directly to the radiator, so that is a little bit easier to access. But when the valve cover gasket starts to leak, it ends up leaking on the hose on the bottom of the expansion tank, and as you can see, even this one, it starts to expand, and usually whenever oil hits rubber, this starts to happen, and then you'll start having leak. The cooling system on the E90 is arguably better than the E46. The expansion tank doesn't tend to blow up like the E46, and there's usually a lot less issues, but they did revise the way that the water is pumped. So the water pump is electric on these cars. It's going to be it's actually very hard to get to. It's underneath the motor and between the subframe, so it's a lot harder to access, and it takes a little bit longer. Since it is electric water pump, those do fail without any warning. They're a lot more expensive. So the electric water pump on these cars, they're about $300, and then the thermostat is right next to it, so you want to do that as well. And now if you have a valve cover gasket leak, it will leak all over all those hoses that are there, and you'll end up having to replace all those hoses. The lifespan of the electric water pump is usually around 60 to 80,000 miles, and then you end up having to replace it, which is very similar for most cars. So that's just cooling system maintenance. Like I said, it is more expensive and it is harder to get to. Next, we have the oil separator hoses. Whenever you're removing the intake manifold, those oil separator hoses tend to break, they crack, and then you end up having to replace them. They're not as readily available as the E46 ones have become, so if you do end up doing any maintenance that requires removing the intake manifold, make sure you have those hoses on hand. Next common issue we have is the cabin filter assembly. These tabs always tend to break, and on top of that, these bolts, they tend to strip out the holes that they attach to, so usually you end up having a loose cabin filter cover, or you might just have broken tabs and you have to replace the whole cover. Also, another issue are the ignition coils. These cars are very picky with ignition coils, especially the 335i motors, the N54s, N55s. If you end up having to replace one ignition coil, usually that throws off the system and you end up having to replace all 6 at once. So that's another issue. They're not that expensive. I think they're about $28 to $30 for the Bosch ones. So this right here is the N52, like I said earlier, but you have the N54, which is a 335i. Those are the early model engines. They have 2 turbos. So the 335i N54 motors, they tend to have weaker turbos, especially when you start modifying them. If you do like a JB4 tune or anything like that, the turbos end up going out a lot quicker. The seals start going out. The N54 does have more room to actually get more power out, but the N55 is overall more reliable. Continuing on with the 335i's, they also have issues with their fuel pumps. The high pressure fuel pumps tend to go out, and those are a little expensive. They're about $250 to $300. Then you also have the injectors. The injectors are pretty expensive. They're $165 each. Those also tend to go out. BMW does have an extended warranty in place, but by now the early model N54s are mostly all out of warranty. Also, the 335i's, they do tend to run hotter. So usually they have an oil cooler attached to them, and the oil cooler sometimes starts getting clogged or is not sufficient enough. So you end up having to replace that with an aftermarket unit, or you can usually just clean out any debris that's in front of it. It does make it a little bit harder to do other maintenance as far as intake manifold, the oil filter housing, gasket, all that stuff. It's a little bit harder on the 335s. Also on the 335i's, N54, N55 doesn't matter. There's a lot of carbon buildup, so you have to get your intake valves walnut blasted. I would say about every 30 to 40,000 miles. You could do it even earlier. With all that carbon buildup, you usually start experiencing misfires, stumbles, issues with cold starts. And I mean, that's one of the inherent things on the N54. A lot of people complain about it. Even after intake valve cleaning, they still have those misfires or stumbles when they first turn the car on. There's like a little vibration. It doesn't trip any check engine lights or any fault codes, but you do have that little stumble every now and then. But for the most part, the valve cleaning with walnut blasting does take care of that. Another issue with these cars, especially the automatics, is the transmission. So most of the later model BMWs after the E46, E39 era, they started putting in the ZF 6 HP transmissions in. All those transmissions, for the most part, have a plastic oil pan, and what happens with that is actually the filter is built into the pan, so you have to replace that whole assembly whenever you're doing a filter and fluid change. And if you do end up bottoming out, if you're missing a cover or anything like that, if that pan gets punctured, which is very easy to do since it is a plastic and it's reinforced with some other material, it is very easy to puncture that pan. So the pan is a little bit weaker and the filter is built into the pan. Also with the transmission, you have the issues with clunks. So especially when you're downshifting, whenever you're coming to a stop, there's a very common clunk between the second and first. Usually what that is the Mechatronics sleeve. So the Mechatronics is the whole electronic unit that has all the solenoids and stuff in it, and it's pretty much the valve body. What happens, there's a sleeve where the valve body attaches to the rest of the transmission housing, and that sleeve is made out of rubber. Whenever it cracks, it'll start releasing pressure whenever you're coming to a stop, and that's why you get that clunk. That sleeve itself is not that expensive. The transmission fluid that goes in these cars, the ZF Lifeguard, is about $18 to $20 a quart, so the overall transmission service is a bit more expensive. Alright, so now that we've covered most of the drivetrain issues, let's continue on to the interior. So the first and most common issue with the E90 interiors, E92 as well, are the cup holders. So cup holders are right here in the dash. As you can see, they're pretty flimsy, they break very easily, and almost every one that I've seen, at least one of the cup holders is broken. Next, we also have the steering lock. The steering lock is controlled electronically, and the motors tend to break, and it usually results in a host of other problems. Then another common issue are the door lock actuators. Each and every single door lock actuator, this is more common on the sedans. The actuators end up going bad, and then you won't be able to unlock and lock the door. If your actuator goes bad with it in the locked position, it is very hard, and it is very difficult to remove the door panel to get to the actuator and to pull the door. It is possible. I've done it numerous times. It just makes the whole job a lot harder. Unless it's in the unlocked position, then you don't have that many issues. And another common issue, a lot of people might not see it as an issue, is the audio systems that are available in these cars. So the Logic 7 audio, it is very hard to put any other aftermarket stereos in, double din, any other aftermarket, even like the E09 units. They won't work with the optic audio. Usually you have to run another amp and you have to do a lot more wiring. So they're not as plug-and-play friendly as the basic hi-fi systems that are available. Now let's go on to the rear of the car in the trunk area so we can discuss some problems there. So in the rear, this is a more common issue with coupes, not as much as sedans, but the taillights. So they have these LEDs that go across. The taillights, either it's just usually a bad ground or connector issues. They start flickering or they start not coming on at all. Then you can wiggle the connector. Sometimes they'll come on, sometimes they won't. But that is a very common issue on the coupes. So one of the biggest issues that E90 owners, especially the ones that are not really into modifying cars, complain about is the ground clearance. Even on a completely stock E90, E92, the car is actually a lot lower than previous BMWs. So as you can see right here, this is a completely stock E90 330i. It does have the 18-inch wheels, and I mean, if you look at it right here, you might think that there's a lot of ground clearance. But if you look at all the bumper, there's so many scrapes all over it, all down the side skirts, and that's just because of the ground clearance. From factory, these cars come with run flats, and they're actually pretty skinny tires. They're not that meaty. That also doesn't help the ground clearance. So that's it for this video. The ones that I talked about, those are the most common issues that come into the shop. So that's why I try to make a video for you guys. These cars are starting to get a lot cheaper now, just like how the E46s did after their 10-11 year mark. So you can pick these up for relatively cheap. They're going for about 4 to 5K for a very beat down model. And if you go like the 335i's, they're still holding their value about 8,000 to 9,000. But all these cars have more mileage, so you're going to end up having to start doing all this maintenance that I discussed. On the E90, E92s, they are a lot more expensive than the E46 in terms of labor, in terms of parts. So I'll actually try to make a whole nother video on that to compare the E46 with the E90. If you guys like these kind of videos, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you have any other questions, if you want me to take a look at your car, do a quick inspection, anything like that, feel free to message me on Instagram at ShopLifeTV. I am located in Alhambra, California, and we can set up an appointment and go from there.